The Orioles would certainly love to go get Dylan Cease this offseason, but are the Padres asking for too much? And is he even going to get traded? We'll break that down coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, February 11th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to take a look at the Dylan Cease situation because Roch Kubatko of MASN wrote over the weekend about how the Padres, at least when there were trade talks between San Diego and Baltimore, had checked in on some of the O's top players, seemingly some guys the O's really aren't going to be willing to deal, and guys that it wouldn't absolutely take to go and get a rental pitcher like Dylan Cease. So we're going to break down who the names are, if it is too much for the Orioles to give up, and if there is still a chance the Orioles could make a deal for an ace like Cease before this offseason is over. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started today. So let's talk about Dylan Cease. As we've gone through this offseason, and it became clear that the Orioles were not going to re-sign Corbin Burnes and that they, despite making an offer, were not able to get Blake Snell to sign in Baltimore. And really the ace-type free agents had come off the board, and the Orioles were not willing to go the distance money-wise to spend on those guys, or years-wise as well. We pivoted to the trade option. It's what the Orioles did about a year ago when they acquired Corbin Burnes from the Milwaukee Brewers. And we looked around the league and we said there are options out there who could be dealt if the Orioles want to go that way again, dip into their prospect pool and come back with that top of the rotation guy. Because this roster looks pretty good. The biggest hole is a true number one. It's what they don't have right now atop their rotation. And we looked at some names, and seemingly Dylan Cease was the name that kept coming up. The Padres may be wanting to move some payroll. He's an impending free agent. They don't think they're going to extend him or re-sign him. His name kept coming up, and that seemed like the perfect fit for an Orioles team that was certainly going after Cease last offseason when he was with the White Sox, and they eventually did trade him to the Padres, actually on March 13th, still over a month from now. Last year is when they made that deal well into spring training when he had 2 years of control left. But this comes up now because Roch Kubatko was doing a kind of Q&A thing over at MASN over the weekend, and someone asked about Dylan Cease, and he reported that at least when the Padres and Orioles have had trade talks surrounding Cease, the Padres have checked in on the availability of Samuel Basallo, Jordan Westburg, and Coby Mayo in terms of guys they were targeting from the Orioles in a potential Cease trade. Now, we don't know a lot beyond that. Not a lot leaks out of this Mike Elias front office. It really hasn't since he took over back in November of 2018. And so you get these little bits and pieces, but you still never really know the true truth until something happens or the season starts and something doesn't happen. You know, there wasn't a lot of murmurs about Corbin Burnes, and then all of a sudden, boom, he was on the Orioles last February. So you never quite know. But from the Padres' perspective, it would make sense that they would be asking for guys like Basallo, Westburg, and Mayo. The Orioles have a lot of young position player talent. Basallo and Mayo are guys that aren't even going to be on the opening day roster and going to be in AAA because this team is so talented hitter-wise. And they should ask about those guys. But we haven't heard about anything further. What we have heard is reporters talking about the Dylan Cease asking price is still very high from the San Diego Padres at this point in the offseason. And there's been teams that have been like really aggressive, like the Minnesota Twins have been in that camp for the last month. And it seems like they're not really closing in on Dylan Cease this offseason. I'm not sure if they're going to do it. And it might be because their asking price is just too high. And if the Padres in talks with the Orioles are going to stick on those names, Basallo, Mayo, and Westburg, this deal might just not get done. Now, in general, in terms of the Padres just trading Dylan Cease, they've had a couple of holes on their roster. They're fairly cash strapped. They are going through this ownership change. Of course, Peter Seidler, who came in and spent a lot of money to make this team better, he tragically passed away, and now there was a fight between his wife and his brothers, and one of his brothers recently was named the control person for now of the team by Major League Baseball, so you have a little bit of it cleared up. It's still not nearly as much. It could be an Angelo-style fight coming up here for San Diego ownership, and so they want to get under a lot of the luxury tax payroll thresholds and want to still have some payroll room, and they're looking at a guy like Dylan Cease, who is due to make about $14 million this year in his final year of arbitration before he hits free agency after the 2025 season. He's a talented ace-type starting pitcher who could bring back a lot in a trade. And with their money issues right now, and the fact that Cease is a Boris client, is probably not going to sign an extension at this point, I think the Padres know, hey, we're not going to extend him now. We're probably not going to be able to even re-sign him in free agency. So they're thinking, even though we're going to be a good team this year, and Dylan Cease would certainly help us if he's in our rotation, if we can find the right deal where we can offload his $14 million, give us a little more flexibility, and get some younger, more team-controlled players that can help us right now in 2025, we would make that deal. And that was seemingly the Padres thinking, and they had some holes they had to fill. They need probably at least another starter if they don't trade Cease, and if they do, they probably need two more. And they had a hole kind of at DH. They had a hole in left field because they let Jurickson Profar walk, and he signed with the Braves. And I thought maybe, hey, Heston Kjerstad, they're looking for an outfield option of multiple years. A Kjerstad and a Cease deal could work tremendously. I wasn't sure if the Orioles would be willing to deal him, but then the Padres went out and kind of plugged their left field hole over the weekend. They signed both Connor Joe and Jason Hayward to one-year deals, and those two guys are basically going to platoon in left field for the Padres. And Joe and Hayward are still major league level caliber free agents at this point and major league level players who could help the Padres this year. But I don't know if they specifically targeted Joe or Hayward, but players like that, platoon type outfielders, are going to be out there in the offseason for one-year guaranteed deals for a while. Like, those are guys you can kind of go and get whenever you want. The Padres didn't have to, in the first week of February, go sign those guys to plug that hole if they felt they could plug that hole via a Dylan Cease trade. Now, again, if you get an upgrade in left field, having Connor Joe and Jason Hayward at this point is not going to stop you from still upgrading there if you're trying to win a World Series like the Padres are. But those moves by San Diego told me a little bit of like, okay, they are not gung-ho knowing they're going to trade Dylan Cease for like a right now outfielder. And maybe it's because they're going to get a right now DH or get some young starting pitching or whatever it may be. But I think it's just a little hint that they're not assured they're going to deal Cease at any point this offseason because they chose another route to fill that hole in left field. And again, the Padres are a good baseball team. If they can still keep Cease, which it seems like monetarily they at least have the chance to do, and they could also trade somebody else as well, like Luis Arraez, it would certainly help them be better in 2025 if they kept maybe the ace of their staff in Dylan Cease. They still have a roster that I think could win a World Series. Not the best roster in the world right now, but absolutely could win a World Series with their star power. But if the Orioles want to do this deal, I'm not sure if they're willing to give up a Mayo, a Basallo, a Westburg for a rental pitcher. And we'll get to that in the next segment. But I feel like the Orioles, even if they didn't give up one of those three, could still make the deal here. And that's where it's a little concerning, because it's like I went into this offseason feeling like you didn't have to give up one of those guys and you could still put together a package to get Dylan Cease. And obviously we don't know anything beyond this little reporting we've gotten from Roch over the weekend. The Orioles and Padres certainly could have had more talks beyond that about more players. It's certainly possible and most likely probable at this point. We just don't know. I worry, though, that they're setting a hard line with the Orioles and saying, hey, if one of those three guys, Basallo, Mayo, Westburg, isn't involved in the trade, we're not dealing him to Baltimore. And that would be a little concerning for the Orioles, because I feel like they could pull it off in other ways. Like, even though they've signed a couple of outfielders, the Padres need like a DH/first base. Tirso Ornelas, who's never played in the big leagues and is not like a top prospect, is projected as their opening day DH right now. I don't know if they'd want Ryan O'Hearn because he's a rental and they're trying to get guys with more control. And that's probably why they want Coby Mayo at first base. But wouldn't Ryan Mountcastle, with 2 years of team control, and that ballpark is very favorable to power hitting right-handed batters, wouldn't that be a good fit for San Diego, a cheap fit for the next 2 years to put in at first base and DH. And either way, like whatever the Padres do, they need more pitching. And especially if they're going to deal Dylan Cease, you would think they would need at least one young starter back in that deal. Because right now, looking at their rotation, if they trade Cease and don't get a pitcher back, 3 through 5 in their rotation behind Michael King and Yu Darvish is Randy Vasquez, Matt Waldron, and maybe our old and hopefully future friend Juan Nunez. I mean, it does not look good at the back end of that San Diego rotation right now. They need help either way, and especially if they deal Cease. So that could allow the Orioles to put Cade Povich, Dean Kramer, Chase McDermott potentially in that mix. And I feel like there's a package there. And let me know in the comments section here on Locked On Orioles YouTube page, like if the Orioles offered Dean Kramer, Ryan Mountcastle, and a pretty good young pitching prospect like Luis De Leon, and that 3-player package for Dylan Cease, would the Padres say no to that? Like maybe they would. Maybe they feel like they have a better offer on the table. Maybe you could throw in a draft pick with those 3 guys as well. Maybe Kramer, De Leon, Mountcastle, and a comp pick. I feel like that could get Dylan Cease. Like there are definitely ways for the Orioles to not give up one of those top 3 guys and for the Padres to still get a good return for a rental pitcher. I know he's great. The Padres just traded for him. Now, that was with an extra year of control when they did it last offseason, so they kind of know what he costs. I feel like even if that's not all the way there, Kramer, Mountcastle, De Leon, and the comp pick, that feels close to what a rental pitcher should be worth. And maybe it's not, but I don't know if the trade talks are going to continue or have continued, if the Padres were just ending it, if Basallo, Mayo, or a guy like Jordan Westburg were not going to be involved. So let's talk about that next. Let's say the Padres really did set that hard line, but the Orioles were still willing to chat about those guys. Which of those 3 would the Orioles be the most likely and least likely to deal, and how would it impact their roster if they did trade one of those guys for someone like Dylan Cease? We'll talk about that coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. The live betting feature over at FanDuel, it's great. Keeps every moment of the game exciting. And plus, the app is easy to use. And when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That is FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So let's say it is the case that the Padres either want Samuel Basallo, Coby Mayo, or Jordan Westburg, or they're just not dealing Dylan Cease to the Orioles. Where would you go if you're the O's? Let's rank them most to least likely for the Orioles to trade in a deal like that. I would think most likely of the 3 would be Coby Mayo. Now, certainly, he's big-time prospect, top 10 guy in the big leagues, got his cup of coffee and his debut at the end of 2024, could be a great hitter. And the Orioles would have 6 years of team control. Like Coby Mayo will not be a free agent until after 2030. Like the Orioles have a lot of time potentially with Coby Mayo in their lineup, but he could be a fantastic power hitter. I think he will be. But right now, he does not have a spot on this Orioles opening day roster. And if you are the Orioles and you're operating like they've been doing, which is trying to win, but not necessarily being willing to give out those big long-term contracts, especially to pitchers, you're going to get Dylan Cease as a rental. It's the same situation as Corbin Burns. He's got 1 year left. He's a Scott Boras client. They'll give it a go to try and bring him back like they did with Burns this offseason, but it doesn't seem likely they'd be able to have him here past 2025. So you are getting a rental, and that's what you have to kind of weigh here versus 6 years of Coby Mayo. But if you're going to get a rental like Cease, you're trying to win the World Series in 2025. And there is a chance that Coby Mayo doesn't have big opportunities to help the Orioles win very often in 2025, just because of how the roster is set up. Now, Coby Mayo feels like the perfect roster replacement for someone like Ryan Mountcastle, big power hitting right-handed hitting first baseman. He could fill in there perfectly. But if there's no injuries, like how else does Coby Mayo fit into the lineup? Now, we know there's always going to be injuries, and Mayo is certainly going to get his chances in 2025. But with Jordan Westburg at third base, all-star, Gunnar Henderson at shortstop, all-star, and Jackson Holliday was just recently the top prospect in baseball at second base, that fills up your infield. You've got the Mountcastle and O'Hearn platoon at first and chewing up DH, and you obviously have some DH at-bats for Heston Kjerstad, and your outfield's fairly set as well. Like, there's just not a lot. You're going to DH Adley and Gary Sanchez a little bit. There's just not a lot of space for Coby Mayo to get regular at-bats. And honestly, because he still does have to work on his third and first base defense in AAA, and he didn't have a lot of success when he did hit in the big leagues last year, I think it's still helpful for him to spend some time at AAA to begin the season, which is going to happen. Like, unless there's an injury, Mayo's going to be in Norfolk to begin the year. So he's just not someone who initially, and again, if everyone stays healthy, he's not going to have the biggest chance to help you this year. So if you're going for it this year, that does make sense. Now, if you're looking forward, if you're holding on to Ryan Mountcastle and instead trading Mayo, you've got Mountcastle for 2026 as well, with the wall moving back in. Maybe Mountcastle's production ticks up again. You get a good first baseman for each of the next 2 years. So you've got that covered. Like, yes, Ryan O'Hearn is a free agent after this year and will probably be gone, but you've got Heston Kjerstad and you've got Tyler O'Neill, and you're going to have Samuel Basallo mixing into that first base DH probably in 2026. So you'll have that covered with other players who are already in the org. Like, the O's can trade Coby Mayo, and they can operate without Coby Mayo. Could he go and be great and better than some of the guys the Orioles have? Absolutely, and it could sting a lot. But they can operate not just this year, but beyond without Mayo. And that's why I feel like if the Padres were saying it has to be one of these three guys and the O's were still willing to talk about it, Mayo would be number one on the list. Number two, it was tough for me because I think there is a drop-off after Mayo being the definite number one, then who's two and who's three. I decided to put Jordan Westburg at number two, most likely out of the three. Now, obviously, it is hard to give up an everyday player who just made the All-Star team in his first full big league season and still has 5 more years of team control left. Is not a free agent until after 2029. Like, that is a hard thing to give up. But same way with trading Mayo. If you would keep Mayo and you trust Coby Mayo defensively, he can be your third baseman. If you did really deal Jordan Westburg, Coby Mayo could slip right in there. Now, if you're doing Westburg, I mean, he's already established himself. That's why he's down below Mayo on this list. But theoretically, Mayo can fit at third. Now, the O's have already said they feel more comfortable with Coby Mayo defensively at first base. So I don't know how great you feel about putting Mayo in immediately as your everyday third baseman if you traded Westburg right now for Cease. But there are some questions about the swing and miss in Westburg's game and potentially knocking him down. How will that impact him moving forward? I don't think it's crazy that 2024 could have been Westburg's best offensive output and he starts to struggle a little bit more. But we've also talked about, with Westburg missing those 2 months with the broken hand and what the Orioles offense fell into and how much they missed Westburg when he was out last season. He's a very important cog in this Orioles offensive machine, and they would miss him a lot. Just not a guy I would trade at this point. I would have been more willing to do it back when he was in his prospect days in the minor leagues. But now that he's established himself and made an all-star team, I just wouldn't do it. And you might say, Connor, okay, then why is he not number 3? Well, that's how good I think Samuel Basallo is going to be. And that's why I could have switched him, but I put Basallo at number 3, least likely to 3 deal. Like, I just have, even though the Orioles have an all-star catcher ahead of him in Adley Rutschman on the roster for the next 3 seasons, I just have so much belief in Samuel Basallo that he is going to be an all-star level hitter and above. And here's the thing. The Basallo and Rutschman duo, that could be one of the best catching duos ever. Like, I heard them talking about it on Rates and Barrels the other day and talking about how catchers, like the catcher WRC plus in the playoffs is like 81. They just get so worn down. Maybe the next frontier for teams is to try and hoard 2 good catchers on your roster so you can split playing time more throughout the season, and then they're more rested when they get into the postseason. Think if you can do that with 2 elite hitters like Adley Rutschman and Samuel Basallo here in a year or 2, like that could have the Orioles having a level up on every single team in Major League Baseball. Nobody's going to be able to put together a better catching duo than Rutschman and Basallo, plus the fact that Basallo can play a little first and he can DH, and the bat is just, I think, going to be so special from the left side. And yeah, you can make the argument, oh, he's kind of blocked because of the catcher here. But his bat's going to get him, I think, on the field no matter what. He's still only 20. He got to AAA. I mean, the sky is the limit for Samuel Basallo. He is number one, my please don't trade him list right now among prospects. And again, Westburg has the established big leaguer all-star thing going, which would be really hard for me. So that's where I kind of come down here. Like, I'd be willing to talk about Mayo. The other two, it's just a non-starter with Westburg or Basallo. And I honestly think, from the Mike Elias perspective, I don't think he would trade any of these three guys for a rental starting pitcher, even a rental ace like Dylan Cease is. I'm just not sure he'd be willing to give up that many years of control of a really good to potentially great player to get 1 year of a guy like Cease. Just the way that, not saying I agree or disagree with it, it's just that the way Elias has operated tells me that he's not going to be willing to deal one of these guys for a rental. And you can say, Connor, well, they dealt top prospects for a rental last year to get Corbin Burns. And yeah, they did. It was DL Hall, Joey Ortiz, and a comp pick going to the Brewers in that Burns trade for 1 year of Corbin Burns. But that package is different than any of these guys. Like, DL Hall was a reliever at that point. A very good reliever, but a reliever. The Orioles knew that. It's only a matter of time before the Brewers know that too. It's not going to work as a starter. The injuries, the inconsistency, he's a good reliever. He could be a great reliever, but relievers are only worth so much. And in a perfect world, with that same infield I just mentioned, with Westburg, Henderson, and Holiday, and then, of course, guys like Mayo, I mean, Connor Norby was still in the mix, Arias and Mateo, like, Joey Ortiz was a back-end top 100 prospect, a really, really good player. He had debuted for the Orioles already in 2023, but he was expendable. I think everyone kind of agreed that Ortiz is going to be a good player. He's probably going to be the starting shortstop for the Milwaukee Brewers this year. He was the starting third baseman for an NL Central championship team last year. He was expendable. Like, even at this point, if Ortiz was still with this team, I'd still feel okay with Westburg, Henderson, Holiday being that third, short, second, and Ortiz being more of the utility infielder. So if he's going to be your utility guy, he's expendable. And then that comp pick, it was nice that Elias was willing to deal that pick to go and get Corbin Burns. And I know that I had a similar conversation about Mayo being a little bit expendable in the same ways that Ortiz is. Like, where is he going to fit in the roster? Just had that conversation. But Coby Mayo is a top 10 prospect in baseball right now. Joey Ortiz was, like, at best a top 50 prospect, but was never to the level, especially with the bat, that Coby Mayo is. And I think Mayo just has a higher upside than Ortiz. They are different levels of prospects. Hall and Ortiz just don't meet the level that Mayo, Westburg, and Basallo do. And that's why I think it's different here. And again, I would be willing to talk about Coby Mayo here, but I'm just not sure the Orioles would. So if that's where the Padres are stopping, I'm not sure they're going to get a deal done with the Orioles. And quite frankly, I'm not sure they're going to deal Dylan Cease at this point. He may not be even available because the prices are so high right now. So then I guess the question is, like where would the Orioles go then? Do they just go into the season with this rotation? Do they look elsewhere? What are the other options looking like? We'll get to that to finish the show coming up next. So if the asking price is too high for Dylan Cease, or he's just off the table at this point, it was a guy who is going to help the Padres as well. Like, this is a guy who threw 189 innings to a 3.47 ERA last year with a 29% K rate and an 8% walk rate. Like, he was a ace level starting pitcher in 2024, and he can do it again this year before hitting free agency. Are there other options out there? And there were for a while this offseason, but they are dwindling as well. Reports out of Seattle recently are that the Mariners definitely aren't going to trade the younger starters, and now they don't seem willing or likely to trade Luis Castillo, so that option kind of off the table. Houston has come out and said, their front office, that they aren't going to trade Framber Valdez, who is a free agent after this year. Now, crazier things have happened. I still think he could get dealt, but it seems unlikely at this point. The Minnesota Twins were reportedly the heaviest bidder for a while there to get Dylan Cease from the Padres, and they're being kind of stymied by the high asking price, it seems, as well. But if the Twins were trying to go get Cease, they're probably not going to then turn around and trade away Pablo Lopez with 3 years of control, who's got ace-type material. So I feel like that ship has maybe sailed. And if the Padres aren't going to trade Cease, they're probably not going to trade Michael King. I know it's a possibility. He's come up in rumors as well, also an impending free agent. But King is cheaper in 2025, and this trade is a little bit more about the money. And I think the Padres, and the reporting has been this, they are more confident they can either extend Michael King now or at least get him to re-sign this offseason. Much more confident that they can do that than they can do the same thing with Dylan Cease. So I think they're more likely to just hold on to Michael King. And so he falls further down the board. And as I mentioned, Dylan Cease was traded on March 13th of last year, well into spring training. So it's not like at February 11th we're at too late to get a deal done, right? The Corbin Burnes trade was February 1st. We still haven't even had pitchers and catchers report. Like, something could absolutely still happen here. But it almost feels like it's kind of Cease or nothing in terms of going to trade for an ace. Like, if he's either not dealt or someone else outbids the Orioles and makes the trade, I'm not sure there's another option that's truly available. And again, Cease might just stay in San Diego, and that's a different conversation, right? It's two different conversations. It's one, if Cease just stays in San Diego, the asking price is too high, the Padres just hold on to him, that's one thing. It's like, well, nobody could get him. It's a separate conversation if another team trades for him and outbids the Orioles and actually makes the deal. Then we have a more concerning conversation about the O's this offseason. But either way, the Orioles, they might go into the season with this rotation. The Grayson Rodriguez, Zach Eflin, Dean Kramer, Charlie Morton, Tomoyuki Sugano rotation, with the Albert Suarez, Cade Povich kind of initial number 6 and number 7 depth. And the Orioles could always add at the deadline. But right now, they are short that number 1 arm. And they won the division. They won 101 games in 2023 without Corbin Burnes, without really a true ace. Now, Kyle Bradish pitched like an ace, and Grayson Rodriguez was absolute nails down the stretch. And Kyle Gibson gave them more than they ever could have thought. And Kramer was good at the end of the season. Like guys outperformed and Bradish pitched like an ace. So maybe that has to happen this year. I think what could happen is you get really good Zach Eflin and you get Grayson Rodriguez to finally stay healthy and take that step to being an ace, similar to what we saw from Kyle Bradish in 2023. If that happens, the O's have a good bullpen, a good lineup, and a lot of rotation depth that if Grayson Rodriguez does make that step forward, I think they're good, and they may still be in the position to add at the deadline, which they still have the players to go and do. But if Grayson takes that step forward, then maybe in August or September, maybe if you're lucky, you could get Kyle Bradish back and he's feeling good for the postseason and you can add him there as well. You've got the depth behind it. They're in a place where if they do not make a move, this is still a playoff roster. I absolutely think this is a playoff caliber roster. I think it's an AL East winning and World Series winning roster. Wait and see. But I think this is certainly one of the top 6 rosters in the American League and a team good enough to absolutely get to the postseason with just who is here in Baltimore is heading to Sarasota right now. But they still could definitely use that number 1. They've just kind of backed themselves into this corner where that number 1 just might not be out there for the asking price anymore. So we will certainly see if any more Cease rumors pick up and absolutely have them covered here on the shows. We are getting very, very close to pitchers and catchers reporting, a couple of days away. It's coming up on Thursday. We are almost there, people. Of course, we're back here 5 days a week on the pod. So if you're loving that, baseball is back. Super Bowl is over. Football's in the rearview mirror. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Also, if you can, wherever you're listening, you could subscribe there, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Leave a 5-star rating and a review. That really, really helps out the show. I will be back tomorrow. We have a few more players, just a couple more guys, kind of breaking down their 2024 seasons and doing the outlook on what 2025 looks like. So tomorrow, I wanted to look at Albert Suarez. We still haven't really done the full breakdown of that incredible Albert Suarez out of nowhere 2024 season. So I want to look at how he came in and did that for the Orioles. And then also, I feel like his role is kind of up in the air. With the additions the Orioles have made, he's kind of been pushed out of the rotation heading into 2025. He could have a bullpen spot as a long reliever, but he's out of options. And the stuff and the metrics don't make it seem like he can repeat what he did last year. So there's a lot of questions about Suarez going into spring training. We'll kind of break those down and look at his magical 2024 season coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.